Have you ever wondered why, after getting everything you once craved, love, attention, validation, you still felt empty? Why the applause faded, the passion cooled, the touch no longer thrilled, and all that remained was a strange silence? What if that silence wasn't failure, but an invitation? There comes a moment, sometimes in the middle of a relationship, sometimes right after a passionate night, sometimes in the quiet just before sleep, when desire begins to dissolve. It doesn't vanish in a dramatic collapse. It fades quietly, like the last ember in a fire that once roared. And when that happens, most people panic. They run. They search for a new spark, a new body, a new distraction. Anything but the stillness that follows. But what if that stillness is not the end, but the beginning? What if when desire fades, the soul begins to speak? Carl Jung once said, "What we resist persists, but what we look at disappears." When you stop running from the fading, when you finally turn to face the space left behind by vanishing desire, something unexpected happens. A door opens. A deeper presence emerges. Not the craving to be touched, but the aching to be known. Not the hunger for another, but the return to yourself. This is the journey few speak of. Not the chase of more, but the awakening within less. And if you felt this quiet shift in your life, then you're not lost. You're awakening. Let's walk that path together. There's a moment, so subtle, most people miss it, when the fire of desire begins to dim. You're lying next to someone you once longed for, yet your heart is silent. The texts that used to thrill you now feel muted. There's no anger, no heartbreak, just a gentle quiet where once there was craving. And in that quiet, the mind begins to panic. We've been taught that desire is life, that hunger equals vitality. If you don't want, you're numb. If you're not chasing someone, something, somewhere, then you've lost your spark. But what if that spark burning out isn't a loss, but a signal? What if it's the soul reclaiming space from the mind's obsession? At first, this silence feels like absence. Something is missing. Something must be wrong. We tell ourselves, "I'm not trying hard enough. I need more passion, more stimulation, more connection." But underneath that noise lies a deeper whisper. Maybe, I'm tired of chasing what never satisfies. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." And so, instead of sitting with that silence, we flee into new relationships, new apps, new habits. Anything but the void. But the void isn't empty. It's sacred. It's a portal. This is the moment of sacred pause, when the outer world loses its grip, and the inner world begins to awaken. It's not detachment. It's descent. A descent from the superficial into the soul. And though it feels like losing something, you're actually regaining yourself. You start to notice the rituals of noise that used to keep your restlessness alive, the late-night scrolling, the compulsive checking, the need to be wanted. Suddenly, they feel heavy. Not because they've changed, but because you have. Something in you no longer wants to be chased, or even seen. It wants to be known, by you. In this state, strange things happen. You may feel empty yet full. Quiet yet on fire. Alone yet finally accompanied by a deeper presence that's always been there, waiting behind your longing. And the mind can't make sense of it, because this isn't something you figure out. It's something you feel. Something ancient. Something that cannot be named. Jung called this the withdrawal of projections, when you stop using others as screens to reflect your unmet needs, and instead pull those needs home. You see that your obsession with being desired wasn't about love, it was about validation. You realize that craving attention was a cry for your own attention. And in that seeing, you begin to dissolve the illusion. Desire fading isn't a failure. It's the soul whispering, "Now, it's time for you to return." This is the beginning of sacred self-reclamation. And although the world may not understand it, the silence you're entering is not loneliness. It is sanctuary. And in that sanctuary, the soul prepares to speak. Have you ever noticed how desire promises everything, but often delivers nothing lasting? It arrives like a storm, loud, intoxicating, urgent, and we chase it like it's the answer to a question we can't quite name. We believe, if I can have this person, that success, this body, this feeling, then I will be enough. And for a moment, it works. The kiss lands. The applause echoes. The eyes of another reflect back the illusion of worth. But then, it fades. Always. No matter how beautiful the moment, no matter how deep the intimacy, it softens into silence. And when that silence arrives, most people go back to chasing. But some don't. Some sit in that silence long enough to ask, what is it I was truly hungry for? This is the turning point, the hidden doorway between the ego's addiction to desire and the soul's longing for truth. And that doorway is quiet. No fireworks. No music. Just a slow, almost painful realization. I was never looking for them. I was looking for me. Carl Jung described this moment as a descent into the unconscious. The first phase of the individuation process, when we stop outsourcing our wholeness to others and begin integrating the fragmented parts of ourselves. It's not a clean process. It's confusing, disorienting, even depressing at times. Because without the high of desire, we are left with everything we've been avoiding. And yet, there is a strange peace that comes with it. You begin to see clearly for the first time. You realize how many of your relationships were built on need, not love. How many decisions were driven by insecurity, not freedom. How often you've tried to be someone else's enough, because you didn't know how to be your own. The hunger underneath desire is not for pleasure. It's for presence. That aching to be touched? It was the soul longing to be felt by you. That obsession with being seen? It was a cry from the self, asking, will you finally look at me? Even the sexual hunger, in its deepest layer, is a metaphor, pointing to our desire to merge with something sacred, timeless, whole. But we've been conditioned to stop at the surface, to think orgasm is the goal, that validation is love, that craving is connection. And in that belief, we stay hungry, forever consuming, never nourished. But something changes when you sit with that hunger instead of feeding it. You begin to feel a new kind of energy emerge, not outward, but inward. A calm, a spaciousness, a steady heartbeat beneath the noise. This is the moment when the soul takes the mic. And what it says first is not always profound. Sometimes it whispers through tears. Sometimes through stillness. But always through truth. It doesn't care how desirable you are. It only cares how present you are, to yourself, to the moment, to the reality beneath your distractions. And that is the very beginning of awakening. Not a spiritual high. Not a lightning bolt of enlightenment. But a quiet, trembling honesty. I'm done chasing. I want to return home. At first, the fading of desire feels like a death. A soft, slow extinction. You're no longer lit up by what used to ignite you. The fantasies no longer seduce. The old games no longer thrill. Even the people who once made your heart race now leave you unmoved. You feel empty. And this is where most turn back. Because the culture we live in does not honor emptiness. It fears it. It pathologizes it. It tries to fill it with scrolling, swiping, shopping, sex, validation, noise. Anything but stillness. Stillness is too dangerous. In the quiet, something begins to surface, something we've spent our whole lives avoiding. Carl Jung called it the shadow, the part of us we exiled long ago. The abandoned self. The child who wasn't safe to cry. The teenager who was punished for softness. The adult who learned to seduce instead of speak truth. The parts of us that were too intense, too emotional, too wild, too hungry, too much. And now, in the absence of distraction, those parts return. Not as monsters, but as memories. Flashbacks. Sensations in the body. A tightness in the chest. A grief you can't name. And you begin to realize, the fading of desire wasn't the problem. It was the key. Because when the heat goes out, the shadows become visible. This is the descent. And it's not glamorous. You might cry without knowing why. Wake up in the middle of the night with a strange ache in your chest. Feel a growing distance from the people around you, even the ones you love. It's not because you're broken. It's because you're shedding. The masks. The roles. The personas. You're meeting yourself for the first time, without performance. And it hurts. Because when desire fades, you don't just lose passion. You lose illusion. You see where you betrayed yourself to be chosen. You remember the nights you gave your body when your soul said no. You confront the truth. Much of what you called love was a transaction. Much of what you chased was escape. But in this darkness, something else begins to flicker. Not pleasure. Not stimulation. Presence. A light that doesn't flare, but glows. Most people think healing is a light-filled journey, full of mantras, incense, sunsets, and smiles. But in truth, real healing starts in the dark. In the silence. In that raw, unfiltered moment when you finally stop pretending. Not just with others, but with yourself. When desire fades, the mask collapses. And for the first time, you're not trying to seduce, perform, or earn affection. You're just there. Naked in your own presence. And that's when the shadows start speaking. You hear them in your doubts. Am I still lovable if I'm not desirable? Will anyone stay if I no longer entertain? Who am I without my roles? The answers don't come easily. But the questions themselves are sacred. They are the very doors you've avoided your whole life. And now, in this rare moment of inner stillness, you finally have the courage to open them. Carl Jung believed that wholeness requires us to integrate the shadow, not to destroy it. Because the shadow isn't evil. It's wounded. It's the part of you that learned to survive. That buried its rage to keep peace. That silenced its voice to avoid abandonment. That offered its body when it truly craved presence. And now, all those fragments are coming home. You might feel grief for the version of you that didn't know better. Compassion for the one who settled. Rage for the years you spent pretending. But alongside that grief, something unexpected appears. Power. Not power over others, but power within. Because when you stop running from your own darkness, you realize it's not your enemy, it's your gateway. The very hunger you thought would destroy you becomes the teacher. The silence you feared would isolate you becomes the sanctuary. The emptiness that once haunted you becomes space for something real to emerge. And that real is not always loud. It doesn't shout or beg to be seen. It whispers. It waits. It watches. And it only comes when you're brave enough to be fully alone with yourself. In that still, sacred darkness, you begin to remember something ancient. Something your body always knew but your mind had forgotten. That wholeness isn't found in another. It's found in the reconciliation of everything you are. Desire fades. And in its place, the soul begins to rise, not as fantasy, but as truth. You no longer fear the silence. What once felt like exile now begins to feel like home. You stop reaching for distractions, stop performing for approval, stop trying to be more than you are. Instead, you begin to listen, to the tremble in your chest, to the tightness in your throat, to the ache that pulses quietly behind your ribs. These were always messages, not flaws. The body never lies, it just speaks in a language most of us were never taught to hear. You begin to realize that the emptiness you feared isn't hollow, it's holy. It's not a void, it's a womb. And something is growing there. Not a new identity to replace the old, but a deeper self you've never truly met. This version of you doesn't chase. She doesn't need to be the most beautiful in the room. She doesn't perform softness to be loved, nor harden herself to be respected. She simply is. Still. Deep. True. And in her presence, you begin to understand that desire wasn't your enemy, it was your mirror. It reflected everything you believed you lacked. And now that you no longer see yourself as lacking, desire shifts. It no longer arrives as hunger, but as alignment. It doesn't scream, more, more, more. It gently asks, is this true for you? And for the first time, you have the clarity to answer. From your center, from your body, from your soul. You begin to discern what once overwhelmed you. You no longer mistake attention for affection, chemistry for compatibility, or urgency for importance. You no longer run toward what's shiny, you lean into what's still. And there, in the stillness, you find a power that isn't reactive, but receptive. A presence that doesn't beg to be seen, but cannot be ignored. This is where you begin to walk differently. Speak differently. Choose differently. Not because you're trying to prove something, but because you're finally anchored. The hunger that once drove you is gone. And in its place stands a kind of inner fullness that doesn't require explanation. This is the quiet strength of a soul that has faced itself and stayed. Of a woman who no longer fears being alone, because she is finally with herself. This is not the end of desire, it's its transformation. From fire to ember. From urgency to devotion. From grasping to grace. And in that grace, you don't lose your passion. You deepen it. You don't stop feeling. You feel more clearly. And now, when desire does return, it no longer seeks to fill a void, it seeks to express a truth. A truth that was born in the dark, midwifed by silence, and raised by your courage to stay when it hurt the most. You begin to move through life differently. Not because you're trying to be different, but because you simply are. The woman you once were, the one who sought, who needed, who reached, is no longer leading. In her place stands someone quieter, steadier, deeper. You walk into rooms and no longer scan for who might want you. You listen without planning your next line. You look people in the eye not to impress, but to see. The world hasn't changed, but your way of being in it has. You see the same invitations, the shallow affection, the addictive highs, the offer to play roles you've long outgrown. But now, you pause. And that pause changes everything. Because in that space, you can hear your soul whisper, this is not for you. Not out of fear. Not from trauma. But from truth. A truth born in silence. A truth that no longer needs to be convinced. And this truth becomes your compass. You begin to notice how many conversations are not really conversations, but performances. How many relationships are negotiations of wounds. How often connection is just two people using each other to avoid themselves. And it no longer satisfies you. Not because you're bitter, but because you've tasted something more. The peace of your own company. The strength of your own silence. The clarity that only comes when you're not acting out of hunger. Carl Jung wrote that wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration. And now, you feel integrated. Not perfect. Not fixed. But present. And presence is power. The kind of power that doesn't dominate, but disarms. You begin to realize that you don't have to prove yourself anymore. You don't have to earn love by performing worth. You don't have to chase energy that doesn't choose you. Your body feels it instantly now. That contraction when something is out of alignment. That expansion when it's true. And so you trust it. You begin to say no, not from anger, but from clarity. You walk away, not to punish, but to protect your peace. You choose solitude, not because you've given up on love, but because you've stopped confusing noise with intimacy. You become someone new. Or perhaps, someone ancient. A version of you that existed before the world told you who to be. And the world begins to notice. Not because you're louder, but because your silence now speaks volumes. And then one day, love appears again. But not in the way it used to. It doesn't knock down your door or steal your breath away. It arrives gently, like morning light across a quiet room. It doesn't ignite chaos, it calms the storm. And you almost don't recognize it at first, because it doesn't come wrapped in adrenaline. It's not performance. It's presence. And this time, you meet it differently. You don't shrink. You don't mold yourself to be wanted. You don't ask, what do they need me to be? You ask, can I be fully myself here? Because now you know what it feels like to live without pretending. You've lived through the emptiness. You've touched your own soul. And you've made a home there. So anyone who enters that space must come with reverence. You don't rush. You don't over-explain. You let things unfold in truth, not in urgency. Because urgency is no longer your compass. Integrity is. Alignment is. Peace is. You've learned that love isn't proven by how fast someone moves toward you, but how deeply they can hold space for your becoming. You no longer crave the high. You crave the steady, the honest, the soul-level resonance that doesn't flare up in a flash, but burns consistently, like a hearth fire on a winter night. And you've become that flame too. You've become the warmth you used to seek in others. So love is no longer about being chosen. It's about being met. Fully. Respectfully. Without masks. And if someone cannot meet you there, you no longer collapse. You no longer fight for their potential. You no longer hand over your softness in the hope they'll handle it well. You protect it. Not with walls, but with discernment. You are not hard, but you are holy. And that is a different kind of strength. You begin to see that the fading of desire wasn't the end of your story, it was the beginning of your freedom. You stopped chasing. You turned inward. And in that turning, you found the source. The well that doesn't run dry. The sanctuary that doesn't depend on anyone else's validation. And now that you live from that place, everything changes. Your standards shift. Your energy becomes magnetic, not because you're trying, but because you're clear. You no longer search for the one. You become the one who is whole enough to walk beside another, without losing yourself. And that, truly, is when the soul awakens. You begin to realize that awakening is not a single event. It's a quiet decision repeated over and over again, in the way you speak to yourself in the mirror, in the way you no longer chase someone who can't meet your depth, in the way you make tea slowly instead of scrolling to escape the silence. It lives in the smallest places. The breath you actually feel. The food you eat because your body asked, not because your mind demanded. The conversations where you no longer smile to keep the peace, but speak with grounded truth. You don't always get it right. You're still human. There are days when the old hunger knocks again. When you feel that longing rising, sharp, urgent, familiar. And you might reach. You might momentarily forget. But then something inside catches you. Not in shame, but in presence. A gentle voice says, "You've been here before. You know what this is. You don't have to go back." And you pause. You breathe. You choose differently. Not because it's easy, but because it's true. And in that truth, something sacred strengthens. Not a performance of spirituality. Not a curated image of healing. But a quiet integrity that can't be faked. A rootedness that doesn't need to announce itself. You become a woman who walks slowly, sees clearly, loves consciously. A woman who no longer mistakes intensity for intimacy. Who doesn't confuse being needed with being valued. Who doesn't settle for sparks that only burn but never warm. You begin to find joy in what's simple. Clean sheets, a deep laugh, an honest no. You protect your energy like a sacred flame, not because you're better than others, but because you've learned how precious it is. You stop over-explaining your worth. You stop arguing with those who don't see you. You let silence speak where words once fought. Not out of withdrawal but out of mastery. Because when the soul awakens, she no longer needs to prove anything. Her presence speaks louder than her performance ever could. You walk into rooms differently now. Not to be desired, but to be aligned. Not to impress, but to embody. And those who can meet you there will feel it instantly, not because you demand it, but because your very being invites it. And those who can't, they simply fade away. And you let them. Because you know that anything not aligned with your truth is not a loss, it's a clearing. And in that clearing, your life becomes a sanctuary for the sacred. Not just a concept of awakening, but the living, breathing experience of it. Every step you take now is an offering. Every boundary is a prayer. Every day you choose your peace over your past, your truth over your hunger, your soul over your craving, you rise again. And in rising, you remind others, desire may fade, but when it does, the soul finally has space to speak. And slowly, without needing to announce it, you become someone others notice. Not because you're louder, not because you shine brighter, but because your energy no longer leaks. You carry a certain quiet in your eyes, a steadiness in your presence that unsettles those still looking for themselves. Some will be drawn to it. Others will resist it. But all will feel it. Because wholeness is magnetic. It reminds people of the parts of themselves they've abandoned. You're no longer participating in the old games, trying to win attention, outperform pain, or earn your existence. You live from center now. And in doing so, you give others silent permission to return to theirs. You're not trying to be anyone's teacher. You're not performing awakening. You're simply living it, moment by moment, breath by breath. And that is what makes you powerful. Not because you dominate, but because you no longer disappear. In relationships, you speak with clarity, not to control, but to connect. You no longer beg to be chosen, because you've already chosen yourself. Your love is no longer given out of lack, but out of fullness. You no longer overextend. You don't explain your standards. You embody them. And in that embodiment, people sense something different. They might not have words for it, but they feel safer, or more exposed. Either way, you're no longer adjusting your light to make others comfortable. You've stopped apologizing for being too deep, too intuitive, too sensitive. Because now you know, those were never flaws. They were invitations. Invitations into the sacred. Into presence. Into truth. You've become fluent in the language of energy. You can feel when someone is disconnected from themselves. And instead of trying to fix or carry them, you stay rooted. You hold space, not from saviorhood, but from sovereignty. Because the awakened soul knows, you can love someone deeply without losing yourself in the process. You can offer kindness without self-sacrifice. You can care without collapsing. And that balance, once impossible, now feels natural. Effortless. Real. You move through rooms like someone who doesn't need to prove she belongs. You've stopped seeking mirrors in others. You've become your own reflection. And in that, you are dangerous to everything that profits from women being small, desperate, distracted. The system doesn't know what to do with a woman who no longer buys into the illusion of lack. A woman who doesn't need to be wanted to know her worth. A woman who no longer responds to chaos, but creates calm. She cannot be manipulated. She cannot be sold an identity. She no longer chases love. She is love, grounded and alive and whole. And when you live like that, the world shifts around you. Not always gently, but always truthfully. Now, you understand that your transformation was never just about you. Yes, it began in the silence of your body, in the fading of desire, in the dark night of your forgetting. But it was never meant to end there. Your journey inward was always meant to ripple outward. Not through effort, but through essence. The way you hold eye contact without fear. The way you listen without agenda. The way your presence speaks long before your mouth does. You're no longer waiting to be recognized. You are no longer hoping someone will finally see you. Because you see yourself, and that changes how others respond to you. Some will walk away. They must. Not everyone is ready to meet a woman who doesn't need anything from them. And that's okay. Let them go. Their leaving is not your loss, it's your liberation. Because now you no longer abandon yourself to be loved. And those who remain, those who come close and stay, they don't just see your surface. They feel your soul. They respect your boundaries. They breathe in your silence like air. They walk beside you, not ahead of you, not behind you, but beside you. As equals. As witnesses. And that is the kind of love the world desperately needs. Not possession. Not performance. But presence. Wholeness. Reverence. You realize that every time you said no when your body wanted to say yes out of loneliness, every time you sat with your hunger instead of feeding it with distraction, every time you chose stillness over validation, you were building something. A foundation of truth. A temple of sovereignty. And now you live inside it. Not as a recluse, but as a quiet fire. You carry this frequency into rooms, into conversations, into your work, your art, your choices. You're no longer here to survive. You're here to serve. But not from martyrdom. From overflow. From clarity. From alignment. And your very existence becomes a mirror. A mirror for those who are still pretending. A mirror for those who are secretly longing for something real. Something whole. Something sacred. You don't push them. You don't save them. You simply shine. And that shining does more than any argument, any plea, any performance ever could. It reminds them that this too is possible. That healing is real. That silence is not absence. That when desire fades, the soul awakens. And when the soul awakens, it no longer looks for permission. It simply lives. Fully. Freely. Fiercely. Because it remembers. It always was. If something inside you stirred while listening to this, don't rush past it. Let the silence settle. Let the words echo. Maybe this wasn't just a video. Maybe it was a reflection. A mirror of something you've long known, but never had the language to name. A forgotten truth that your soul always remembered. And if you're here, still watching, still breathing in the quiet, then you already know, this path isn't about becoming someone else. It's about remembering who you were before the noise. Before the hunger. Before the chase. You don't need to be fixed. You don't need to be saved. You are not broken. You are becoming. And in this becoming, your presence is the revolution. So if this resonated, share it. Not to go viral, but to be of service. Maybe there's someone out there whose desire is fading too. Someone who thinks they're lost, when in truth, they're awakening. Leave a comment if you feel called to. Let this space be a sanctuary. A sacred circle for those walking the path back to themselves. And if you want to walk this path together, subscribe. Not for numbers, but for nourishment. Every word here is a seed. Every silence, fertile soil. Every video, a quiet ritual. Because here, we don't just talk about healing. We remember it. We live it. We breathe it, together.